Without further ado, it is with great honor that I introduce to you Ben Shapiro.
It's awesome to see y'all. So, it's good to be here. I did promise my social media guy that I would actually take a selfie with all of you. So, if you don't mind. All right. Now the millennials will be happy. So, first off, it is great to be in the great state of Florida. One of the best decisions of my life. I want to thank the UCF administration, the UCF CRs, Young America's Foundation, Fred and Linda Allen for making all of this possible, and thanks to Dee Dee for the kind introduction. Thanks also for your patience. When we first initiated this event, I think most of you were in preschool. So tonight I'm going to be talking about why people need to stop begging to be coddled. Because we now have a society that demands coddling. It's a society where being coddled is seen as something good, where a society that coddles you is a better society. Now, here's the thing. Reality is filled with all sorts of risks. The risk that you might try at something and then you might fail at something. The risk that you might make a mistake and bear the consequences. Or the risk that you might run into somebody who doesn't think like you, and this may hurt your feelings, make you feel bad about yourself, make you feel threatened. And more importantly, we live in a society that is now deemed risk to be off limits. Risk is seen as a bad thing. Now, in the past, you really had no choice but to face down risk because reality demanded that you face down risk. You had to cross continents to seek your fortune. You had to form families to take care of children. You had to find a community to find a support structure. You had to go out into the world, and you had to mitigate risk by creating structures for yourself that mitigated those risks, or you had to take risks and possibly reap the benefit and also possibly reap the whirlwind. Now we live in a virtual universe where we can pretend to make our own realities. We can bubble ourselves off from reality. We can define ourselves subjectively and insist that everybody around us applaud. Carl Trueman is a really good philosopher from University of Utah. He has an excellent book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which I think is maybe the most important book of the last 5 years. And Trueman writes that identity, our own personal identity, it used to be constructed around your interaction with the world. Right? There's who you were, you're born, you're a baby, you have certain innate characteristics. I have 3 young children. Basically, children are small monsters who are extremely cute, right? This is God's trick, is you want to take care of them because they're extremely cute, but also they're terrible little people. Right? Every so often they do something like, oh, they're so wonderful, and then they start screaming at you and remind you why they need to be civilized. And that's sort of the point. The way that we create our identities is by becoming civilized. What that word means, typically, is that you have to be acculturated to the culture around you. You have to adjust to reality. And who we were, our identities, were wrapped up in our interaction with the reality around us. Now, thanks to the prosperity of modern society, and thanks to the fact that we are guarded from reality by all of these massive economic structures we've built for ourselves, we don't have to worry about reality interacting with us. Instead, we tend to define ourselves by what is most authentically us, our feelings. Right? How I feel about me, without regard to the rest of the world, is what matters the most. And if reality gets in the way of that, reality is a threat. Reality is bad. Reality threatens my identity. It erases me. And so reality has to go away. Reality has to change in order to accommodate us. And that's not just true with regard to identity. It's true with regard to group identity. Instead of recognizing, for example, that in reality, inequality is unfortunately just a part of life. That is just a part of life. Some of us are shorter and some of us are taller. Some of us are smarter, some of us are dumber. That's just the way reality works. And that when it comes to group identity, you could literally draw a line down the middle of any room in America, and you will have inequalities on one side of the line versus the other side of the line. If I took a line and I drew it right down the middle of this room, there would be income inequality between this side of the room and that side of the room. There would be IQ inequality between this side of the room and that side of the room. Right? And those inequalities sometimes, it can be anything. There could be inequality that's genetic. Men and women are, on average, different heights. Right? The equality could be cultural. Korean culture prizes education more than white Appalachian culture, for example. It could be behaviorally driven inequality. There are more black single mothers than white single mothers, right? All of these things create inequality in the aggregate between groups. Okay, that's just a reality. Anywhere you go on Earth, this will be true. There are no two groups anywhere on Earth that are going to be identical in every way. But because of that reality, because that reality is ugly and unpleasant, we instead tend to demand that reality adjust to what we believe should be the case, which is that inequality should disappear entirely and all groups should have the same outcome. Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, says, quote, "If we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity in condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination, which allows us to demand that our society, the richest society in history, bar none, thanks originally to our embrace of risk, thanks to our willingness to undertake risks on behalf of prosperity, we demand that our society remove risk entirely. And then, when bad things happen, we double down. There's no risking and failing. Society must have failed." Which is actually, you think about it, it's actually an attractive pitch, because it means that nobody actually has to take responsibility for themselves. If you try and fail, it's not your fault, it's society's fault. If there is some sort of inequality out there, it might not be because people need to make different decisions or adjust to the reality. It's because reality itself needs to be restructured. And the best news of all is that there are a group of experts who will do it for us. We can simply contract out all of the risks, all of the problems in the world to a cadre of experts who are going to tell us exactly what to do. Human nature does drive us in this direction, by the way. Human nature drives us in the direction of trying to push away risk by handing over power to experts. This is why authoritarianism is far more common throughout human history than freedom. Freedom is an invention of the last couple of centuries. It really did not exist en masse until the last couple of centuries, and even then, really only in the last since the end of the Soviet Union, has it been sort of the broad movement of the public across the world. But for the vast majority of human history, literally hundreds of thousands of years, tyranny and privation and bloodshed were more the way of the world than the notion of liberty. Why? Well, because human nature is loss averse. Human beings, because we have a lizard brain, our lizard brain evolved in the jungles, we wish to avoid loss, right? We don't want to get hit. So there are a couple of psychologists, social scientists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. You may have read Kahneman's book, Think Fast, Think Slow. And they talk about something called prospect theory. Okay, what they find when they look at human behavior is that we have an innate part of our brain that always seeks to minimize loss. And so, for example, I'm going to give you two scenarios, and you guys tell me which one you want. Okay, so here are the two scenarios. One is you have a 25% probability of losing $6,000. Okay, so 75% probability you lose nothing. 25% probability you lose $6,000. That's scenario number one. Scenario number two is that I flip a coin, and depending on which side of the coin comes up, you have a 50% probability of losing $2,000 or a 50% probability of losing $4,000. So which one of these two options would you prefer? Do you prefer option number one, 25% probability of losing $6,000 and 75% probability of losing nothing? Or option two, you flip a coin, either way it comes up, you lose $2,000 or you lose $4,000. So show of hands, who prefers option number one? Okay, and who prefers option number two? Okay, so this is a mental trick. Nearly everybody in the room picks option number one, right? Okay, well, here's the thing. They're exactly the same. Okay, on a probabilistic level, your prospective loss there is exactly the same, right? A 25% chance of losing $6,000 means you have an expected loss of $1,500. A 50% chance of losing either $4,000 or $2,000 means that the expected loss is the same. Right? The expected loss is going to end up being the same in this particular scenario. That's because in the former case, we think maybe we'll lose nothing, right? We're loss averse. And in the latter case, there's a 3 and 4. In the latter case, we are guaranteed that we're going to lose something. Right? So we would always prefer the situation where there's a possibility where we may lose nothing. Okay? The point here is that human beings, because we are loss averse, because we are constantly seeking to avoid loss, we are willing to give over power to people who help us avoid the loss. And you combine this with what's called the planning fallacy being the belief that we can plan our way out of risk. And what we think is if we can hand it over to the experts will get rid of all the risks. Okay? We want to be coddled. Human beings have a natural tendency. It's not just a left-right thing. All human beings want to be coddled. Right? It's just the truth. You have to train yourself not to want to be coddled. When you don't, you end up with what we have on college campuses, for example, with regard to free speech, where we all want to avoid risk, right? We want speech codes that protect our egos from the possibility of words hurting us. In fact, we go so far as to redefine words as violence so that they can never hurt us. When it comes to the meritocracy must be rejected too, because what if we fail and then we're blamed for our own failures? Now, listen, in the meritocracy, there's nothing more meritorious about somebody who's smart than somebody who's stupid, right? Those are inborn qualities very often. Okay, but the meritocracy does mean that there are externalities that benefit wide swaths of people. If smarter people tend to do well, that benefits everybody because they contribute more in terms of social capital and social value because of the products and things that they are designing, right? But if you can get rid of the meritocracy, it makes you feel a hell of a lot better. Phoebe Cohen, the geosciences professor at Williams College, recently said, quote, "This idea of intellectual debate and rigor as the pinnacle of intellectualism comes from a world in which white men dominated." Right? If that's your belief, that does ensure that you're never going to feel too bad about yourself when you fail. It also destroys all of the fundamental bases for having a civilization. On a broader level, this is the message of critical race theory. According to Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanczyk, or some of the founders of critical race theory essentially holds four basic tenets. Tenet number one is that racism is ordinary, not aberrational. It is the way that society, these are direct quotes, "This is the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country." Second, that these systems of oppression serve, quote, "important purposes, both psychic and material, for the dominant group, namely white Americans." Third, that race and races are the product of social thoughts and relations. So all groupings are essentially arbitrary, but they're created by white people to harm other people. And finally, that minority status, quote, "brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race and racism." Meaning that if you're a person of color, you get to speak about race and racism and nobody else does. Okay, when you take that together, what that really means is that all inequality is inequity. It means any discrepancy can be chalked up to systemic racism without ever having to explain how the discrepancy occurred. You never have to actually point to a problematic policy in order to explain why the discrepancy exists. You just point to the discrepancy, and this in and of itself means that all the institutions are bad. Right? Everything good is fruit of the poisonous tree. All those institutions were built by rich white men who were seeking to enshrine their own racism in the way the institutions work. Right? Boiled down into less nuanced form, CRT sounds precisely like Ibram X. Kendi. Okay? And this is a way of reducing risk in how you think about yourself. It's a way of reducing your mental risk. Now, here is the thing. Our aversion to risk, obviously it applies across the board. It applies to finance. We outsource nearly all policy to the Federal Reserve at this point. We have a cadre of experts who are supposed to decide how much your dollar is worth and also keep down unemployment. We outsource all COVID policy to supposed experts who happen to screw it up 6 ways from Sunday while maybe funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan. All these experts fail. And that failure makes us angry because we have been lied to. We've been told we can hand over everything to the experts and they will push a magic button and they will fix everything. But they're lying to us. That's not the case. And when they fail, they have two alternatives. They can admit it or they can get us to turn on each other. And so when the experts who have promised us they will mitigate all risks, when that doesn't work, instead they blame you. They tell you to blame your neighbor. It's your neighbor who's standing in our way. And so my call today is when you get beyond the coddling, what you realize is that the coddling in the end is a shield for people in power to never have to be answerable. If they can promise you that they will mitigate all your risks, even if they fail, they will just blame the person sitting next to you. And if you go along with them, you'll give them more power and more power and more power, but you won't lead a fulfilled life. We actually have to re-embrace risk on a personal level and on a societal level. We have to take the risk of freely exchanging ideas because that's where innovation happens. We have to take the risk of being able to invest and reap the benefits of that risk. We have to take the risks of, for example, in a personal relationship, getting married is a risk. It is foregoing a current benefit for a future gain. Right? You are foreclosing all sorts of other possibilities because you have chosen to make a life with this one person. That is a risk. Marriage is a risk. Having kids is a risk. You don't know what they're going to turn out like. Right? You really don't. And it does vary day to day on what you think the trajectory looks like. But the thing is that those risks make life worth living. The risk might pay off, or maybe you fail and you learn something more deep about yourself. Maybe you learn from the failure and you do better the next time. Or maybe it's just that you've strengthened your own character because you've made free choices in a free way, which is what makes us human in the end. Every decision you make is a risk. The biggest risk of all, of course, is the decision to be free and to take responsibility for your own choices. That's a major risk. But if you take that risk, you become a better and a stronger human being, a more contributing human being, a more valuable human being. You feel better about yourself. When we discard risk, we discard meaning. When we are coddled, we discard our own ability to be a fully adult human being. And here's the dirty little secret. No matter how much we try to discard the risk, no matter how much we try to set up institutions that mitigate against the risk, no matter how many boxes we draw against the people who sit next to us in society, hoping that this will mitigate our risk, you can't actually discard risk. It's inevitable, because reality entails risk, just as it always did. Just as when we were lizard brains wandering in the jungle, there's risk now too. And we can build dams against the risk, and the waters can pile up behind those dams. and then eventually they will blow right through the dam. And when that risk materializes, it'll be a lot bigger and a lot worse than the tiny risks that we have been avoiding all the way along this process. When that dam bursts, it destroys civilizations. Small risks can be channeled, small risks can be withstood. When you build up entire bulwarks and edifices of holding back risk, and then the risk materializes, it swamps everything. It's a huge civilizational mistake. Reality always wins in the end. In fact, I root for reality, because when you root for reality, you're rooting for people to learn how to deal with reality, which again is how we lead fulfilled lives. So we can all do that. We can choose to live free rather than coddled. It'll make us better people, more open people, more understanding people. And when we do that, I think that not only will we be saving the country and saving the civilization, we'll be saving ourselves. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? Can everybody hear me okay? How about now? Good? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to get to the Q&A now. There's Ashley right here, our treasurer. You're going to form a line right behind that green line right there, and we're going to call you up one by one. You're going to stand right here behind this green line. I'll be right here behind this orange line. And we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible, so please have your question ready. And just try to be quick and efficient. We want to get through as many people as possible, so let's just get started.
As always, the rule is that if you raise your hand because you disagree, you get to go to the front. That's always the rule.
So what I just said, if you raised your hand and if you disagreed, you can
Happy birthday over
come
there.
up to the front and we'll ask your questions first.
Oh, and quick correction, because I'm bad at math. The first hypothetical should have been $12,000 versus 0, not $6,000 versus 0. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, Ben. My name is Orlando. You can't notice, but my parents are both Cuban. I'm a Latino American, first generation American. So this is a very important topic for me. There's no real right side to the Hispanic or Spanish media, and I wanted to know why has the right avoided this or hasn't tackled this situation, because as you know, the Latino community is the biggest minority group in these upcoming elections. I wanted to know if you or you with the Daily Wire or any right-sided media is going to tackle this situation for the upcoming elections.
Yo quiero. I mean, I want to. So this is I'm actively taking Spanish lessons like 3 times a week and working on it, because I think it's really important actually for people who are on the right side of the aisle to speak languages that are not English. I don't think conservatism is only the language of English. So first of all, congratulations on being Latinx or Latinx or whatever nonsense we're Yeah, I know. It's whenever people use that kind of stuff, I'm always like, I mean, my Hebrew is much better than my Spanish, but like the notion that you can take a gendered language and make it non-gendered by just force of law is insane. The answer is yes. I was talking actively with a person who's a Spanish-speaking free market economist about doing some stuff for us. I really want to make a move into this market. I really do want to make a move into this market. I think it's really, really important.
First things first, I want to thank you so much for coming here today. You were actually one of my inspirations from going from completely left to moderate and centrist and running towards conservatism.
Okay,
and
thank you.
My question... my question for you is this. How is it that people on the left can pull out these hypocrisies, i.e., guns bad, police bad, but only cops can have guns, a good thing, and when you're able to call them on their hypocrisy, how is it that they can basically run along with that hypocrisy and continue on and continue to try to shut us down?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The internal contradictions in a lot of left-wing logic are pretty glaring. I mean, that is a pretty obvious one that you mentioned, the notion that cops are bad, cops with guns are bad. It's a racist superstructure. Also, the only people who should have guns are bad racist cops. It's a very weird take. The answer is that it makes it very difficult to have an honest conversation when people are willing to entertain these two possibilities at the exact same time without actually mentioning that they're mutually exclusive. And it does make you suspect that truth is not actually a value if somebody is making those points. And so I think one of the great frustrations that we have on the right is that for many people on the left, right, now I do distinguish here liberals from people who are leftists, right? I make this, there's a reason we sell a leftist tier mug, but we don't have a tumbler, but we don't have a liberal tiers tumbler, right? The reason is because liberals are people who disagree with me on politics but don't want to shut me down. People who are on the left, like hard left, do want to shut me down. People who are left-wing and who are interested only in the use of political tools in order to achieve their agenda without regard to consistency of argumentation can't be argued with, and frankly, you're wasting your time. I've said this 1,000 times to people, but when you have a conversation or a discussion with somebody, you really do have to determine in advance what's the purpose of the conversation. This is true in almost every single case, right? Whether you're talking with a friend or a spouse or whether you're talking with somebody on the issue of politics, you have to determine what's the end goal. Are you talking to an audience? Right, and the conversation you're having with this person is really directed out here, or are you trying to convince this person, in which case you have to determine whether they're having an honest conversation. Right? So if they refuse to even acknowledge the logic of the kind of position you're talking about, then it's a waste of time. You really should move on with your life.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much.
Hi, Ben. So in 2019, you went on Joe Rogan's podcast and you had a religious conversation with him. You were asked about your view on Jesus Christ, and you said, Jesus was a Jewish rebel who tried to lead a revolt against the Romans and was killed for his trouble. My question is, Jesus said, give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and the Roman governor even said at first that he was not guilty of any crime. So given all of this, how can you argue that he tried to lead a revolt against the Romans?
Right, so I mean, you're assuming, so I said from the Jewish perspective, right? I'm not arguing from the Christian perspective. I presume that nearly everyone in this room knows the New Testament better than I do. I do know the Jewish perspective on Jesus better than most people who are Christian, right? Because it's a Jewish perspective on Jesus. So the Jewish perspective on Jesus does not accept the historicity of the Gospels. If it did, then we'd all be Christian, right? So the Jewish perspective on Jesus is that, like many people at the time, and this was true throughout that entire period, there were a lot of Jews who were attempting to lead political revolts against the Romans. The Jewish definition of the Messiah is very different from the Christian definition of the Messiah. The Christian definition of the Messiah in the form of Jesus is, of course, a unification of God and man, right? This doesn't exist in the notion of Jewish philosophy. In Jewish philosophy, the Messiah is a person who accomplishes particular goals according to Maimonides, the ingathering of the exiles, the reestablishment of the Davidic kingdom, the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, right? So from a Jewish perspective, if someone was trying to be the Messiah, they would be a political figure. Okay, when I said that he was killed for the trouble, that was not demeaning of him. I assume that if I had been living at the time, I also would have been attempting to lead revolts against the Romans, just like half the Jews were, right? This is why a temple was destroyed. This is why Jews were put into exile several times. So that was not a smear against Jesus as a Jew. It's just a recognition that Jews don't believe in Jesus as a divine figure, and if we did, then we'd be Christian.
Well, then I probably would have changed the phraseology of that, because then again, if that was the case, then he would have been going against Jewish law. Since, say, that would have made him a political figure, then he would have been going against Jewish law, not Roman law. So.
Well, leading revolt against the Roman wouldn't have been going against Jewish law either. So if we want to get into like a long, complex debate over what Jews think about the historicity and the take on Judaism that's in the Gospels, that's a pretty long conversation. Now, honestly, it's really interesting and it's kind of fascinating. But under Jewish law, even if you read the New Testament, Jesus' claims aren't punishable under Jewish law by death, actually. If you look at like the Talmud, for example, what Jesus was claiming to be, even if somebody came along and said, I'm a messianic figure, I am the Son of God, right, that's not actually, the punishment is typically not turning them over to the Romans to be killed. So there's all sorts of, from a Jewish perspective, historical problems. Again, I repeat, I'm not telling Christians don't go to church. I'm not telling Christians not to believe. I'm just telling you what Jews believe about Jesus, which is, by definition, going to be different than what Christians believe about Jesus.
Hello, Ben. Very nice seeing you today, and dreams come true. And and my question is, do you think parents across the country will be able to defeat school boards and eventually change the system of education? So
the answer is it depends on the school board and depends on the location. So yes, I mean, the answer is yes. I think that parents, if they gather together, the good news is nobody votes in local school board elections. So it doesn't take that many votes to overturn a local election at a school board, right? I mean, it's like the immediate family of the school board members and whoever the teachers union can turn out from the homeless shelter that day. Right, that's who votes in school board elections. So if you can turn out more people than that, presumably you can get people tossed off the school board. And I think that a lot of people are now awake to what their kids are being taught. I think a lot of parents, just like with colleges, I think there are a lot of alum who don't even bother to look at what colleges are teaching. They just sign a check to the school that they went to, and then when they're told, they're like, oh man, maybe I shouldn't have signed a check to this particular university. For a lot of parents, they just say, okay, well, I went to public school, and my parents went to public school, my kids are going to public school, what could be so bad? And then when they finally see what exactly their kids are being taught, they say, oh, that's terrible, and then they get really involved, like you're seeing in Loudoun County, which again is a very blue county up in Virginia. So I do think that there is a possibility of revolt. I think it's much strong. First of all, I don't think it's totally necessary in every place in the country. There are some school boards that are not doing this. But yes, I think there is that possibility. And let's just put it this way. The good news is there's still an out, meaning that if these public schools continue to do this, they're just going to drive people out of the public schools entirely, which to my mind is not a bad solution. I'm perfectly happy with tens of millions of children being taken out of public schools and being put into parochial schools, private schools, or homeschooled. I think it's a really good solution.
Hello, it's nice to get an opportunity to talk to you, Ben. I wanted to ask about vaccines, and I wanted to ask, do you think forms of risk aversion for society as a whole, as in mandating the vaccine, and unless you have a medical exemption or a religious exemption, do you think a vaccine mandate would be good in terms of risk aversion for society overall?
So I think that the big problem is when risk aversion turns into complete risk denial. So when you hear Dr. Fauci, for example, say that if you get sick, I don't even want you getting sick, right? Nobody should even get sick from COVID. Like, no scientist worth his salt at this point is pretending that we are going to wipe COVID off the face of the earth. It's just not going to happen. Literally hundreds of millions of people have had it at this point. There will be hundreds of millions of people who have it in the future. It's going to become endemic. Everybody understands this. So then the question becomes, what is the purpose of a mandate, right? Is the mandate going to be effective? Is it a violation of liberty? You don't there is a difference between the kind of vaccines that typically we have mandated and the COVID vaccine. So for example, the polio vaccine or MMR, right, or DTaP, right, these are all vaccines that are very typically mandated at the state level for young kids. These are childhood diseases. The vaccine itself is highly effective, and if you wipe it out at the childhood level, it typically is not endemic in the population. COVID is not a childhood disease. COVID is an everybody disease, but mostly it's an adult disease. It's almost not a childhood disease, right? Kids who are getting it are not dying. The grand total number of kids across this entire pandemic in the United States who have died, according to Dr. Marty McCary from Johns Hopkins University, grand total of kids who have died for a year and a half out of a subpopulation below the age of 19 of some 73 million Americans, 10 to 20 healthy children have died of COVID. The entire pandemic. That's out of 700,000 people who have died in the United States. So it's not a childhood disease. Basically, you're vaccinating kids to protect adults. We don't have this. This doesn't exist with any other mandatory vaccine, for example, to vaccinate kids to protect adults. When it comes to adults, we generally don't have mandatory vaccines unless you are in a particular area of American life, right? You don't have to take a measles vaccine in order to work at the grocery store. Right? You don't have to take, like, this is not a thing. When you sign up for employment, typically they don't ask you for your immunization record. That's something that you ask when you go to public school, or if you're in the Army, or maybe if you're in the healthcare profession, but it's like very specific places and very specific times. The notion of widespread vaccine mandates, again, these vaccines are thank God, they are extremely protective against hospitalization and death. They're not nearly as protective against infection, which is fine, frankly. Like, nobody cares how many people get a cold or get a mild flu over the course of a year. I'm not sure why anybody cares if you get a mild case of COVID after having been vaccinated. And if you choose not to be vaccinated because you're a young person and you feel that your health factors don't put you at severe risk, and you say, okay, my chances of dying from COVID as a young person are, say, 1 in 10,000, and my chances of getting a bad effect from the vaccine are, say, 1 in 11,000. So, hell, I'll chance it. I'll go for the natural immunity, whatever. Do I think that the government should force that on you? No. And by the way, I don't think it would be necessary in the case of something like smallpox, when people have made that comparison, which is idiotic, because smallpox killed a third of the people who got it. If COVID killed a third of the people who got it, you wouldn't have to convince anybody to get the vaccine. In fact, there is one subpopulation of the country that has nearly entirely got the vaccine, namely the people who die from it, everybody above the age of 65. Right? If you look in the state of Florida, pretty much everybody who's above the age of 70 has gotten the vaccine. And that's because people above the age of 70 are much more likely to die. It's like 5 out of 100 is the death rate, the IFR. So do I think that mandates are effective here? No, I think they're not only ineffective, I think that they are driving a wedge in society. I think they're hardening people's position on this thing. I think the mandates are not taking into account natural immunity, which is insane considering that every study available shows that natural immunity is far more durable than vaccine immunity to this point in time. We still don't know how many boosters it will take to match natural immunity, for example. Right, we're going to go into round number 3. We don't know that it'll be a round number 4. None of this is to say that people shouldn't get the vaccine. I took the vaccine, my wife took the vaccine, my parents took the vaccine. What it is to say is that you have to make that assessment on an individualized level. And if you choose to get vaccinated, which I do encourage for people particularly who are above the age of, say, 30, and I think that it's probably a good idea if you're above the age of 20. I think 1 dose is probably a good idea if you're above the age of 12. And I think that if you're below the age of 12, I have nothing to say to you. If that's the you know, that's my personal advice based on my speaking with epidemiologists and doctors about this sort of stuff. But if you choose not to get it, that's on you. And then we all move on with our lives. Literally the moment that everybody had the ability to get the vaccine, this pandemic was over from a public policy perspective. And the insanity of telling everybody they have to continue masking up until the end of time, or we're going to mandate it a business that you have to fire employees because they're not vaccinated. This is when I talk about risk aversion to the point of being completely in denial of full-scale reality. I'm talking about the people who won't go back to work after being triple vaxxed.
I would want to ask a quick follow-up question then. Do you think you said that people aren't like at risk themselves that are healthy, but do you think that allowing them to infect other people after they have COVID, should they not get vaccinated to prevent infecting others, like those who could be immunocompromised or
right? So in terms of herd immunity, so there really hasn't been achieved herd immunity nearly any place on Earth except maybe Sweden, where they allowed it to run through excuse me, large swaths of the population pretty early. I know, you're all dying now. I know. I've killed you all. This is the stand. I'm very much pro the idea of herd immunity. I just don't think that it is going to be achieved with this disease, particularly given the fact that we thought that we were close to herd immunity, then Delta hit and it wiped through the population. Bottom line is, again, given the fact that natural immunity, what I've said to everybody is this: you're going to get COVID immunity. It is your choice how you choose to do so. Do you choose to do so by getting COVID, or do you choose to do so by getting a vaccine? There is no third choice where you just avoid COVID entirely. And if you're immunocompromised, the fact is that you should be taking special precautions in any day and age. And people who are immunocompromised do. If you're seriously if you're on chemotherapy, like the school that we go to, my kids go to, there's a teacher there who's on chemo, and she's very worried about the kids not being masked in class, for example. And the answer to that is, if you've ever met a child is a germ machine. All they do all day is generate snot. That's just what they do. And because all they do is generate germs, if you're taking chemotherapy, you probably should be wearing an N95 anyway. Right? If you're deeply worried right now, wear an N95 and leave everybody else alone. Thanks.
I'm so honored to be talking to you, because I've been obsessively watching your videos since I was 12. I've been obsessed with politics since I could listen to things. And I guess to make a long story short, I decided to pursue politics after I was canceled on Vice and Daily Mail and all these different websites, because I really badly sang the national anthem at CPAC. So I haven't had a lot of traction since then. So what advice do you have for somebody that's going into politics to actually build a following? Because all of my press was negative, so I don't have any fans.
Well, as someone who's had their fair share of negative press, I will say that the thing that you have to find is sort of the market opening. What is the market seeking that you can provide? And this is true for everybody in every field. This is not just true in politics. You need to find the confluence of things that you are good at, that you enjoy doing, and that other people want you to do. Right? People have a very difficult time fulfilling all 3 of these conditions. If you fulfill all 3 of these conditions, you will be successful and famous and rich. Right? Find the stuff that you're good at, that other people want you to do, and that you're actually good at. So what most people find is the thing that they like to do but they're not very good at and nobody wants them to do. Right? And that's how you end up with a low income. Or another way to get a low income is you do something that people would like you to do but you do it badly. Or you hate doing it. So you have to sort of figure out what it is that you want to do, and then you have to provide the market opening. So in journalism or political journalism, the first thing I say to young people is you have to provide information first. So everybody, listen, I have a great job. I get to give my opinions for a living. I was basically working in near anonymity from the time I started writing my syndicated column at 17, kind of until I did the Piers Morgan interview in 2012, right? So that was a long period of time. That was a decade, basically, in the wilderness, nearly writing for free. So number one, expect to make no money and write for free. This is true, by the way, again, for pretty much every profession. You have to work your way up from the bottom. You have to take jobs that you're not going to like, and then you're going to learn how to do a business, and you'll be good at it, right? But at the beginning, you don't know anything, because why would you know anything? You're literally just starting. So you have to do a lot of work for free. You have to find a way to provide people with something that they're not being provided. So if you're doing political journalism, information, and particularly researching things on the ground where other people don't have that information. So this is why I've said to college students what my mentor Andrew Breitbart once said, which is if you have a cell phone, you're now a journalist, right? You get to point that cell phone at things, and there are a lot of newsworthy things happening on campus. So that's where I would start. As far as the negative press in the past, the good news is that everybody has an attention span of a gnat. Nobody cares. Like, we spend so much time thinking about what people think of us that never occurs to us that nobody does. Like, really, like, it's amazing. You know, for me, so I trend on Twitter approximately every 18 days. That's not actually an exaggeration. It's pretty much every 18 days on the dot. And when I trend, I feel pretty good about it because it means there's another 2.5 weeks where I won't. So it's. But when I trend, it feels crappy, right? Because normally they're trending me for something incredibly stupid. I will say that I haven't trended for something that I actually regretted saying for a while. It's usually just something where I'm like, I feel like that was obvious. I'm not sure why I'm trending. And when I trend really bad for several days, it's usually because I said something hilarious or that I at least find funny enough that I'm willing to take the hit. I mean, that WAP thing was hysterical. I don't care what anybody says. That bit is amazing. If you watch it, everybody should go back and watch the original 15-minute monologue on it. Not just me reading the lyrics, the 15-minute monologue, which is one of the best things I've ever done on the show. I appreciate that. It does slap much harder than Cardi B's version. But bottom line is, find something that you can provide to the market that nobody else can. Do it well. Find out whether you like it or not, and then you'll be good to go. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hello, Ben. I love the shout out to Carl Truman. His work critiquing queer theory and gender theory is great, so I love how you point that out. My question is pertaining to gender theory. So it seems like it's become very prevalent in academia and even in conservative circles, per se, the belief that gender and sex are dualistically split and one's identity has nothing to do with their autonomy, their
biology, yes.
Yeah, so I see a lot of conservatives push back against critical theory being taught in schools, right? But where's the large conservative pushback against queer and gender theory, since it seems like some conservatives are fine with saying that gender is a whole linguistic performance, as Butler would say, or it's completely a social construct.
So this is what I do talk about this in my last book, Plug, The Authoritarian Moment. In this book, I talk about the tendency for conservatives to basically give an inch and then be surprised when a mile is taken, right? Conservatives want to be nice. We do. We like to humor people. We actually prefer, not all of us, right? Some of us are jerks, but a lot of us like to, give people what they want, be nice in interpersonal relationships. And so when someone says, I want you to call me by this thing that is not actually objectively correct, we'll kind of go, all right, fair enough, whatever. Like, does it bother me? Is it really a big deal? And the answer is yes. When you sacrifice truth on the altar of being kind, you have sacrificed truth on the altar of being kind. And it's difficult to get back truth once you've killed it. So I think that any conservative who pretends that it doesn't matter, for example, whether a biological male is called he or she, I don't know how you can call yourself a conservative or even really a classical liberal in that sense. I mean, the fact is that there have to be certain objective truths that are objectively verifiable in the world, and we have to use language in a way that we commonly understand and that conveys information. Otherwise, we're just jabbering at each other like animals, and that's not good. Now, as I've said many times, if I'm in a room with a transgender person, we're having dinner together, and this has happened, and the person wants me to call them by their pronouns, in private, I'm happy to call them whatever they want. If they want to call me Napoleon Bonaparte, I'll do it. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. But in a public setting, I am not going to sacrifice the validity of truth on the altar of niceness. I'm not going to do it. Right? If I'm on stage with a person who is a transgender person, I will say that they are biologically male if they are biologically male, and I will call them by pronouns that match their biology, because this is what pronouns are designed to do. They're not designed in order to describe your subjective feeling about yourself, which is unverifiable by any objective metric. Right? Otherwise, we cannot have a language, we cannot have a conversation. So, yeah, I object strenuously to conservatives who think that somehow these are side battles, they don't matter, why don't you just focus on tax cuts? Like, I'm sorry, but if the distinction between male and female, which is perhaps the most biologically ingrained distinction in mammalian biology, not just humans, mammals, right? Sexual dichotomy is a thing in mammals. It is, end of story. It is the basis for all reproduction. If you cannot state that and just state that clearly, then I'm not sure exactly what kind of civilization you think you're defending.
Hey, how are you? So obviously the cancel mob is quite a force to be reckoned with, and I'm sure you have had your fair share of experiences with them. So what would your advice be to someone who has a platform, is conservative, necessarily doesn't deal with politics directly, but what would you give, as far as advice goes, what would you say to someone who could potentially be a target in the future?
So a couple of things. One, I recommend to all of you, get off social media now, right? Do not post anything. If you wish to have a future, come with me if you want to live. Don't put it on social media. Think whether it is worth the fight, right? Look, I started writing column at 17, which means all of my dumb thoughts from the time I was 17 were hitting the internet. I would say that 85% of the things that I regret having said happened between the ages of 17 and 21. Right, really, virtually everything that I've said publicly that I think, man, that was a dumb thing to say, happened when I was very young, because this is when you're developing thoughts. When you do it out loud, and when you do it in permanent form, it's a problem for you. And we live in an unforgiving, graceless, paganistic society that does not allow for people to make mistakes and then walk them back, right? Which I object to in toto. I think it's terrible. I think it's awful. It's the reason why I may be the only columnist in public life who literally has a list on my website of all the controversial things that I've said, explaining whether I think that I was wrong, whether I think I was stupid, or whether I was right, and you just don't like what I'm saying. Right? It's a very long list, because I've written I know I have written millions and millions of words over the course of the last decade and a half, or a couple of decades at this point. So so that's number one, right? If you don't want something made memorialized, don't put it out there. Number two, you don't have to be canceled if you don't want to be canceled. And what I mean by this is that you have to take into account, where you're working. Obviously, if you're working at a major corporation, they fire you, that's a cancellation. But what I mean is, in the culture, because it's an unforgiving culture, the one thing we can learn from Trump is that you never have to apologize and everything will be fine. Right? It really was like. Now, for the sake of society, I'd like to go back to a culture where you can apologize for being a boorish jackass and everything's okay, right? But as long as we're not going to forgive anybody, and the minute you apologize, we're going to step on your throat, then better to be Trump than the guy who's apologizing and gets the boot on his throat. So what that means is that walking toward the fire is actually useful. Very often the cancellation is over nothing, and one of the things we're trying to do at Daily Wire is prove to people that there is a place for people who get booted out, right? This is what we did with Gina Carano, right, for example. Right? This is what we did just now with Allison Williams. If you get booted for not really doing anything wrong, then we want to show people that your life is not only not over, there's a whole other side of the market over here just for you. Andrew Breitbart used to say, walk towards the fire, and I think that's a pretty good strategy.
One more question. Would I be able to get you right here, right now, to pledge your undying allegiance to Matt Walsh's Sweet Baby Gang?
No. Okay.
How are you tonight?
Doing okay. How are you?
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm sure you're very aware of the infiltration of these leftist ideologies in the academic setting. And I was wondering what's your best advice for students like us in discerning between information and theories that are based on valid and reliable research and ideologies that are more kind of just being pushed towards us because they want us to believe those?
And so it is actually sort of important to learn how to read statistics. It's sort of important to learn how to read studies. And you have to spend some time with that stuff and familiarize yourself with that stuff. Because very often studies, for example, just refuse to mention confounds. Right? They'll have a very simplistic analysis of A happens and then B happens, and there's a correlation between A and B, therefore A caused B, for example. That's the obvious one. But usually C caused B. Right? Usually some extraneous factor. Or it could be that the level of significance, that they're playing with the significance levels in a particular study in order to achieve significance, right? Or they're leaving out factors. Here's the thing about academic publishing. So this is a little bit abstruse, but in academic publishing, you only get published if you come up with a significant result. So if you spend a year of your life coming up with a study and the result is insignificant, you now have a choice. You can either file drawer it, right? And you just get rid of the study and say, oh, well, didn't come out the way I wanted. Or you can actually jigger with the numbers a little bit and come up with a level of significance where now you've come up with a brand new study and boom, now you're in an academic journal. Peer review is not actually a wonderfully thought out process. It doesn't work all that well, particularly in the social sciences. So here's what I would say. Your first question, this should be a good place to start. If there is because typically we're speaking about social science here, I assume, right? If there's a social science study and it seems to be a complete rejection of all conventional wisdom developed over millennia, you should think very seriously about whether it's bullshit. And the reason I say this is because accepted wisdom over the course of centuries is in fact a feedback loop. Right? It's been tested and it's been tried over the course of time. It has much more durability than whatever study somebody came up with in the last 37 seconds or so. Right? This is a major distinction that G.K. Chesterton draws between conservatives and liberals. It's the best way to explain it, so I'll just use his language. Right? The basic idea is if you have two people and they're walking across a field and they come across a fence in the middle of the field and they have no idea why the fence is there. The person who is on the left will look at the fence and say, I see no reason why this fence is here. Let's pry it up and move on. And the person on the right will say, I'm not going to let you pry up that fence unless you explain to me why the fence is there. You need to first figure out why the fence is there and why it had been put there in the first place, and then maybe we'll talk about whether we need to remove the fence. Well, there's a tendency in social sciences to say, okay, so we've had generations to know, for example, that two-parent families do much better than one-parent families in terms of the outcomes of their kids, in terms of crime, in terms of poverty, in terms of all the rest. And then there'll be a study, and it'll be seen to contradict all of this. You should think to yourself, okay, I really need to take a second look at this study. I really need to take a second look at this and see if there's a misread or a confound, how large the statistical sample is. Because when you have really durable evidence over the course of a very long period of time that a thing is true, you can't just ignore that wisdom in favor of, okay, a couple of professors from a second-rate university wrote a paper and then it was published in some obscure journal somewhere and is now being cited on NBC Think. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Hey Ben, Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem Shalom.
Thank you.
Little Hebrew lingo for y'all there.
Yeah. It's just how Jews say hello.
Correct. And also, we were planning the banking structure.
After the media discussion, of course. It's an honor to meet you, and thank you so much for coming out. And if you're ever in the area, I'd love to have you over for Shabbos.
I appreciate it.
More Jew stuff. Okay, so my question is that over the past 4 years, we have seen the left become radical in ways that we didn't think was possible. I would say that it's completely un-American to tolerate political violence against your opponent. And we've seen things from advocating for milkshaking. Stephen Crowder did an undercover event where somebody handed, I think it was a producer of his, it was a knife or a pick.
That's the University of Utah,
to target you. Mm-hmm. And I always believe that the left and the right want the same thing, we just go in a different way, where the right goes a bottom-up from the people going all the way up, to where the left goes a top-bottom, where you start from government and it goes down to the people. That's supposed to be the hand that drives. So with what we're seeing and the tolerance for all this violence, for looting, for rioting, and all of these things where they want to remove our rights, re-educate, and do all these awful things to us, I want to still continue to extend a hand. I like having conversation with leftists, but it's become more difficult because there are times where I fear for my safety. I've been surrounded by people, and it's not a comfortable feeling.
Yeah.
So what do we do? Where do we go from here?
Well, I mean, for me, I just pay security to surround me at all times. But if that's not your thing, then look, like I said, you have to sort of assess whether the conversation is worthwhile or not. Unfortunately, that is the reality. I'm also not going to pretend that there are people on the right who have been very casual in their use of terminology about violence. Now, I will say, I think it is much more prevalent on the left. I think it is much more in institutions of power on the left. I think that you saw an entire left-wing institutional infrastructure last year support full-scale riots in many American cities. I haven't seen that sort of institutional support for violence on the right. I don't think it exists on the right in the same way. With that said, I'm going to take issue with the basic idea. I also used to think, that the left and the right wanted the same thing, they just got there in different ways. I don't think that's actually true. I think that they want very different things right now. I think that the right would like a more freedom-based society in which people leave each other alone, and I think the left would like a society in which justice is established at the cost of people's rights, and if that has to be done top-down, then it has to be done top-down. And if it has to be done bottom-up, it has to be done bottom-up. So that's a dangerous situation to be in. The left has gotten much more radical over the past few years. There's no question about it.
So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, though, where do we go from here? And I don't really agree with that premise anymore that we want the same thing, but it's something that I used to think in a
so I think where we go from here is what I've said is the future of the country doesn't lie with the right and it doesn't lie with the left. It lies with all the people in the middle. Which side are you going to take? Right? You're going to have to decide. Are you going to, let's say that you're a center-left person who generally agrees with the far left on tax policy, but you disagree with how they shut down free speech, and you disagree with the rioting in the streets, and you disagree with defund the police and all of that. So now here's your choice. Are you going to go along with the left-wing policy agenda at the expense of the rights, or are you going to say to the left wing, listen, we may agree with you, and maybe we'll get to where you're going slower, but we have to respect the individual rights. If the second thing happens, the country survives. If the first thing happens, we're in serious, serious trouble. Right? This is why I have a lot of respect for people who I disagree with politically. And as people know who watch my show, on the Sunday special, I have people who disagree with me literally all the time. I mean, it happens all the time. And those people I have a lot of respect for, right? Larry Wilmore from Comedy Central, for example, formerly of Comedy Central, or Barry Weiss, right? I mean, like, there are a bunch of, like, Barry Weiss and I don't agree on anything except maybe Israel and free speech, right? And individual rights. We disagree on LGBT issues. We disagree on tax policy. We disagree on social safety, social welfare policy, right? All that stuff. But we definitely agree on the fundamental principle that underlies the country, which is that we have to decide all this stuff by open conversation. Those are the people who are going to decide it. Barry earns more followers than the New York Times, and we're in good shape. The opposite, and we have a problem.
We're going to do 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. Hi, Ben. My question, sorry, I'm a little sick. Not COVID. I got tested, okay? I got tested. Okay, my question is...
It's fine. I'm vaccinated. I don't care.
Okay,
But go ahead.
Me too. Pfizer or Moderna?
Pfizer. I mean, the gold standard.
The gold microchipped. In 2012, the red line documents were exposed that the Israeli government, displaying that their government calculated the exact caloric intake Palestinians needed in order to survive. The Israeli Navy limited ocean access to 12 nautical miles, so Palestinian fishermen only have enough fish to survive for the day with nothing left over. They based their calculations that the Palestinians needed 2,279 calories to sustain the 2 million person population. So they determined they would need 106 trucks importing goods and food into the Gaza Strip. However, between 2007 and 2010, they only averaged 67 trucks. So what do you think of such harsh policies for people who are shot if they try to leave this region?
Okay, so that was a lot. And I don't have the study that you're citing in front of me, so I'll take your word for it. Okay, so the reality of the Israeli-Palestinian situation is that Israel does ship humanitarian goods into the Gaza Strip literally all the time. They were doing it during the Gaza War, during the last Gaza War. Israel is faced with the reality, which is that Hamas runs that area. This is not an Israeli-occupied territory. Hamas runs all internal politics inside the Gaza Strip. Hamas kills its opponents. There's been a civil war ongoing between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in which hundreds of Palestinians have been murdered inside the Gaza Strip. Nobody covers that because nobody cares. The endemic poverty in the Gaza Strip is solely at this point attributable to the fact that a terrorist group has decided to spend billions of dollars on terror weaponry and shipping in weaponry via the sea and smuggling it in over land if they can, although that Egyptian border is locked down pretty tight. The sea is really the only access point, which is the reason why if Israel is going to restrict access, it's going to have to be from the sea. Israel controls the border into Israel. Egypt controls the border into Egypt. There's not a lot of travel over either one of those borders, although Israel presumably would like that, and there are joint Israeli-Arab companies that exist in, for example, right, like directly in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and directly outside the West Bank in which Arabs work. I mean, there are a lot of Arabs who work inside of Israel, for sure, and Palestinians. They're Israeli Arabs. They have the same rights as Israelis. There are Palestinians who don't. They are governed by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. They are governed by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Israel, unfortunately, is faced with an implacable foe that decided to spend literally tens of millions of dollars minimum, and shipped weapon in from Iran on tens of thousands of rockets that they decided to fire into Israeli civilian centers. Let's just put it this way. If today in the United States there were 10,000 rockets fired from Mexico City into San Diego, the American flag would be flying over Mexico City within a week. Okay, that is just the way, and that is true for virtually every country on earth. Israel instead engaged in pinpoint targeted attacks, trying to kill as many Hamas members and as few civilians as humanly possible while shipping humanitarian goods into the Gaza Strip. So the fact that the place is run by Hamas makes it real difficult for there to be any sort of serious humanitarian effort, which is, I mean, the UNRWA has the same problem, right? All the funds for the UNRWA are getting funneled through Hamas, through the Palestinian Authority. A lot of that money is being misdirected to non-humanitarian goods.
Since it's the obligation of the Israeli government at this point to give the goods and services to the Palestinians, right? Wouldn't you say that it's difficult to place their trust in the Israeli government's hands when they're at like an antithetical, like there's an opposition there? Like,
Well, I mean, typically, if you're giving foreign aid, you can't. Is Israel supposed to just like drive the truck into the middle of a Hamas area, open up the back, and say, "People take hands"? Like typically, when you give foreign aid, you have to work through the governing authorities that work in a particular region. If the governing authorities are hijacking all of that stuff and then using it for alternative goods, or selling it, or using it for themselves, then what is Israel supposed to do at that point? It's a serious, serious problem. The humanitarian problem has to be laid at the feet of the people who are the actual rulers of that particular area, namely Hamas, which has been in control of the Gaza Strip completely. There are no Jews that live in the Gaza Strip. Israel pulled completely out of the Gaza Strip in 2005. It was a massive mistake in my view. They pulled out. They left no military personnel inside Gaza proper. They solidified that border. And Hamas has spent the last 15 years having 0 elections, just like the Palestinian Authority has spent the last 15 years having 0 elections and terrorizing its own people.
This will be the last question, just letting everyone know.
Hey, Ben. Really nice to talk to you tonight. My question is about abortion. So usually when I talk about that with other, folks, either the approach is from a religious standpoint or trying to apply science to it. So, but never seen like a kind of like a, happy medium between the two. So are you optimistic that there's gonna be, I don't know, a resolution to that issue, to that approach, maybe from a religious perspective, also with some science in it?
So I think that the possibility of a resolution is going to be more incremental than anything else, and it's happening in real time, right? You can see the American people's opinions on abortion have shifted pretty markedly toward the pro-life position. Now, to get all the way to the full pro-life position that I hold, which essentially is that from conception, this is when life begins, it's going to take more work, it's going to take more education, and it's going to take a ground shift in the way that Americans tend to think about these issues. But as people see with more clarity into the womb itself, as people see the biology more clearly, they're beginning to become less and less warm toward abortion. Like the actual number of abortions in the United States has dropped now to its lowest levels since actually Roe v. Wade, and that is in large part due to the educational efforts of a wide variety of groups. It's due to 4D ultrasounds. It's due to the ability to see more of the human biology. And as people understand that biology better, they're going to be more pro-life. Thank you guys for waiting for 2 years. And I'm so glad that I came. It's great to see you.